Hello! You have just clicked on an in-depth analysis of the classic 1959 film Anatomy of a Murder. If you don't know much about the film, be sure to check out my spoiler-free review linked in the description below, or check out the film as well because there are spoilers ahead. Anatomy of a Murder is a courtroom drama. It was directed by Otto Preminger. At the time, he was just as popular as Alfred Hitchcock. The story of the film is based off of a novel written by John Volker. He wrote it under the name of Robert Traver. He was a Supreme Court Justice, and this story is based off of a real-life case that he took on. James Stewart's character, Paul Beagler, is strongly based off of John Volker's experience during this case. Volker himself was on set to supervise the legal details. Joseph Welch plays the judge, and before this film, he wasn't an actor. He was a lawyer who was an American hero at the time because he had just come off a huge political case. With Otto Preminger being trained in law himself, this makes it a logical casting choice. Most of the time, the performances are generally light, however, intense at the same time. Lee Remick is the best example of this. There's a scene early on in the film where Paul Beagler interrogates her, and I feel as though she plays this scene with a lightness and wit in order to help ease the blow and intensity of this scene. They both play their dialogue-heavy scenes with this ease and humour, and also add their small quips in order to break up the exposition and heavy information. James Stewart's performance here is my absolute favourite in the whole film. In this, he has shied away from his more likeable and pleasant character roles of the 30s and 40s. Here, he is more forceful and even sometimes morally questionable, but still likeable. He plays the role with a level of naturalism I haven't seen him do before. For example, there's a scene where he is using a lot of law-heavy dialogue, and in the process, he forgets his lighter to light his cigarette and he doesn't have it on him. And these small quips really help to break up some of this heavy dialogue. The actors are given more freedom here because Preminger doesn't generally direct his actors too much. This gives them more freedom to improvise a lot more. Perhaps this follows the idea that a director's job is mostly done when they cast actors perfect for the role. It was an interesting choice to have a jazz soundtrack accompanying a courtroom drama. Ellington's soundtrack adds a layer of excitement and lightness to an otherwise dark story. However, it's never used during a courtroom scene, and it works well to keep the balance right. Our main character is passionate about jazz music, so the film's soundtrack is a reflection of his character. It's also been contemplated that the connection between jazz and law is the nature of improvisation. The idea that a lawyer has to make up his defense as he goes, just as a jazz musician does when performing jazz. Paul Beagler is a very unusual lawyer. We don't first see him in a suit, starting off a case or inside a courtroom. We first see him returning from a trip, wearing an interesting fishing costume. He is not unlike Volker, who also loves fishing. In fact, if you search John Volker on YouTube, you'll find a lot of fishing videos. His place is quite run down and fairly shabby. Not the kind of place I would have expected a well-respected lawyer to be living in. In these opening scenes, they constantly mention their financial woes, and I think this sets up the fact that they aren't doing this for the money, but for their love of the justice system and their jobs. The film holds a warm place for the justice system and the courts. However, it also points out its many flaws. Because of this, nothing in the film is perceived as perfect or innocent. There is no good or bad here. The locations in this film are mostly shot in the places where they actually happened. This includes the courthouse or even the scene of the crime. Not a single scene was shot in a studio. Otto Preminger was born in 1905 in what is now known as Ukraine. Later on in life, he moved to Vienna, where he made a film called The Great Love in 1931, before being hired by 20th Century Fox and moving to America to start his American career. In the 1950s, Preminger left the studio system to become an independent filmmaker. This gave him much more control over his films and also had him making more daring films, such as Anatomy of a Murder. Anatomy of a Murder contains a lot of challenging themes for Hollywood cinema of 1959, and even to this day. It features themes and language forbidden by the Hollywood censorship code at the time. Words like rape, seduce, panties, and many other words that I can't say here. The film questions certain morals around the defense of a murderer who isn't depicted as a terrible person, nor a great one either. The same goes with the rest of the characters, who are presented to us more objectively, putting us into the position of the jury. During the 1950s in Hollywood, the code of conduct was coming to an end. This code could control what could be said and done in films at the time. However, Otto Preminger refused to change anything for his films in service of this code. To get around this, the director organized the distribution for his films himself, booking theaters for his films to screen in, and therefore getting around this Hollywood code. Otto Preminger had been doing this since his first independently produced and directed film, The Moon is Blue. This was unlike any other studio director in Hollywood at the time. This was a major push in bringing down the Hollywood censorship code. Moves like this eventually did collapse this code of conduct in the 1960s, which resulted in more freedom for filmmakers all around Hollywood. As a result, you can see that more films in the 60s came out featuring much more violence and risque storylines. Another issue of censorship that Preminger himself personally handled was when a South African theatre contacted him about screening the film. They wanted a certain scene in the film deleted. This scene involved James Stewart and Duke Ellington sitting together, playing piano and performing together. The theatre didn't like having images of a black man sitting with a white man on the same seat and wanted it cut. But of course, Preminger refused and kept the scene in the film. The film opens with an intriguing title sequence by Saul Bass. It features a silhouette dead body made out of paper cutouts. This sequence also employs a unique use of jump cutting as we see body parts appear and disappear and get chopped up into little pieces. The overall mood gives us a sense of uneasiness and obscurity as we witness this jarred body be dissected in front of us, truly giving the meaning of the title of the film. His title sequences are some of the first to take full advantage of many design techniques that have influenced other title sequences in other films later on, including the James Bond films. Saul Bass has also worked with Alfred Hitchcock to create a lot of his opening title sequences in his films, and he's also designed many different posters for films. Preminger's attention to many different aspects of the filmmaking process included the advertising process. This pushed him to work with Saul Bass, and their collaboration together formed a very unique style in posters that they created that was unlike anything that's been seen in films before. Most of their posters sacrificed featuring their actors' faces so they could focus more on interesting and artistic design. Of course, because of this also introduced the risk of people not knowing what actors were in the film and instantly recognizing a face. However, Otto Preminger's name supported the film's success, as he was just as famous as Alfred Hitchcock. Since he became an independent filmmaker, Otto Preminger has had much more control over his films, and as a result, he has been involved in all the different aspects of filmmaking and even producing and directing his films. Because of this, you can see him featured in the film's trailer as he swears in the cast and crew of the film. Let's get into some of the filmmaking techniques. Close-ups are very rarely used in the film. However, when they are used, they are very powerful. Sometimes the camera will push in from a wider shot to a close-up and would do this without cutting. This here is a very technically demanding and skillful use of storytelling and filmmaking. Because of this technique, we end up seeing a lot more longer takes. A lot of the takes in this film run for over a minute long, which is very long by today's standards. This isn't too uncommon to see in a film made in the 50s. However, it's just refreshing to see when going back to watching a film from that era. This is just a testament to how great the cinematography in this film is. Black and white is so sharp, and the lighting just adds extra layers of depth in the film. It's especially gorgeous on Blu-ray. Black and white films just look so crisp on Blu-ray when done right. On the Criterion Blu-ray, it was restored for 4K from the original negatives and looks brilliant. And it comes with a ton of special features as well. The sharpness is probably also attributed to the deep focus. This is a filmmaking technique that is used to have everything in the shot in focus. In this film, it would be especially useful so that we can see the reactions of the characters behind the lawyers and also the entire courtroom, and to really absorb the environment. Especially handy for when the camera is moving a lot around the actors. The film treats the audience as if they are the jury. The characters and the story are introduced objectively. No one is good or bad here. That gives us the chance to think about the rights and the wrongs of the characters ourselves. Sometimes, the camera is placed from the point of view of the jury, and occasionally, the characters in the courtroom talk almost directly to the camera as if we are the jury. Certain points are made that cast doubt on the motives of the murderer and whether or not he was insane. It is brought to our attention that he was in the war and that he didn't suffer the same insanity in the war that he did when he murdered Quill. This point is never later resolved in the film, which makes us question whether or not his acquittal was morally acceptable. This is one of the ways the movie never fully takes sides. However, I do feel it does lean towards his side a bit. The film leaves us with a healthy amount of unanswered questions, as any great film should. Was his final verdict the moral one? Did Biegler convince him to plead insanity when he actually wasn't? Was it really insanity? Overall, this film is fantastic. The acting, directing, writing, cinematography, it's perfect. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell button to be reminded about future videos coming out. Thanks for watching, and long live film!